Hello, everyone, and welcome to this cyber seminar series, Critical Conversations, why Integrative Earth and Environmental Science Might Define Your Future. This unique series was convened in collaboration with the Critical Zone RCN and the National Association of Geoscience Teachers, as well as Quasi. My name is Julia Masterman. I'm the Science Education Outreach Coordinator for Quasi. Quasi is a consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science, and our mission is to advance water science by strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration, providing critical infrastructure through our data services, and promoting education in water sciences at all levels through programs like this webinar series. I would encourage you to visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, or join our community Slack channel to learn more about what we do or to get involved. I'll add information on all those things in the chat in just a moment. Before we get started, a few logistical things to keep in mind. Firstly, this main session is being recorded. You're welcome to turn your video on if you would prefer, but please note that in doing so, you're agreeing to appear in that recording that will be posted publicly on the Quasi YouTube channel later this afternoon. Secondly, later in the session, we will be breaking out into breakout rooms. Those rooms will not be recorded, so no worries about that. And we would encourage you to turn on your video in the breakout rooms, especially so that we can have some good discussion face-to-face. Finally, you'll note that this is a meeting and not a webinar. This is intentional, and we look forward to engaging with you during the breakout sessions. But we ask that you be respectful of everyone in this meeting and remain muted until you are in the breakout rooms. Please ask any questions you might have via the chat. If you notice any unacceptable behavior, please use the chat to notify me, Julia Masterman, or one of the other hosts. This webinar is the second in the series of 6 that will be hosted over the next 2 months. You will need to register for each individual meeting to attend each week. So please do so by visiting the link that I'm about to put in the chat to register for each individual meeting if you have not already. Also, please spread the word to peers and colleagues, share the link, and follow @JoinCZScience and @Quasi on Twitter to stay up to date on upcoming meetings. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Kamini Singh.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this week. I see some familiar faces from last week, which is wonderful. Welcome back. For those of you who weren't here last week, I just want to give a little bit of a sense of what you're in for today. The idea of the seminar series was actually motivated by early career researchers from a meeting we ran last summer who had wanted some sort of critical zone office hours. The idea of being able to engage in a more informal way with people within the critical zone community, learn a little more about what the critical zone is and how you might be able to plug in, and then to have some career development sort of workshops at the end where you can ask questions about what it's like being a postdoctoral researcher or a graduate student or careers in certain areas or work-life balance, et cetera. So we have set this up with that in mind, and I'm super happy to introduce our 2 hosts today with that in mind, Lixin Jin and Diane Dozer from the University of Texas, El Paso. So with that, I will hand it over to them.
Thank you, Kamini, for the introduction, and welcome to the second webinar. My name is Lixin Jin. I'm associate professor at the University of Texas, El Paso, and I'm here along with my colleague and also one of my favorite collaborators, Dr. Diane Dozer. So I think Julia is launching this poll. Can you please just take a few seconds of your time, let us know who you are? All right. Oh, excellent. So you guys can see the poll results at this point? Okay, cool. So you can see that we are really spread over the answers, and the winner of course are the hydrologists, and we even have some people covering the education GQ12. So welcome. I'm glad you are here. So today I would like to take this opportunity and to talk to you guys about, the project we are working on. We hope to use one example to explain, critical zone research is, it's very complex and dynamics, not only the science itself, but also the scientists who study it. So Diane and I want to use one example to explain how we do so using our settings. So most of you probably were here last Friday, and Julia introduced the concept of the critical zone. We know that's a really thin layer from the top of the canopy all the way to the bottom of the groundwaters. And here it's very complex and dynamics where you have air, water, rock, soil, and plants all interacting in such complex manner. And this is also the case for the dryland critical zone that Diane and I are working on. For example, we're in the dryland, so that means we have limited fresh water input. That means rain or snow. We only get 8 inches of rain, mainly through the monsoon season from July to August. And you can imagine that, the natural ecosystem are going to respond to this natural rainfall, these episodic events very quickly. So that's why the water and the carbon are really coupled together. So we really need the hydrologist and the ecologist working together to understand these processes. So a few years ago, a group from Penn State working on the Shale Hills Critical Zone Observatory published this, Spiderweb, where it introduced all the variables that are measured, ranging from atmosphere on the left, that some of the processes are operating at seconds level. If you have a wind event, or you have a rain event, or you have a microbial activity. But on the right, when you go to the landscape or the soil development, it could operate at thousands or even millions of years. And you can imagine that, when you do these measurements, you really have the scientists, in the critical zone to be behind it. And that's why for our dryland critical zone, which was founded last year, have many scientists working together, and they come from very different diverse background. It's very interdisciplinary, and some of them are team members and some are our collaborators. Just point a few to give you the flavor. Jie is a geomicrobiologist. Tom is a dust specialist. We also have hydrologists. We have people who love to do field work. We have people who models a lot. We have people work in the laboratory to run experiments. And also our students are diverse. They have different interests. They also have different level of expertise. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes, Diane and I like to use one kind of question that we struggle in the dryland, and use this example to explain why we need different researchers to work together so that we understand this problem much better, but also make an impact for our local farmers and producers, right? And it's also fun to work together. So for those of you who don't know, El Paso is in western part of Texas. We are border with New Mexico on our north and west. We also have Mexico in our south. And Western Texas is really dry. As I said, we only have 8 inches of rain. So that's equivalent of 20 centimeter rainfall. So naturally, we're not really suitable for agriculture. But if you look at this Google Earth map, where, along these river valley, we have some greens, and those are farmland. Luckily, we do have a big river flowing through, which is actually shown by this kind of a wiggly red lines. That's the Rio Grande River. It actually, on this part of Texas, serve as the border between Mexico and United States. And this river will deliver the fresh waters we can use for agriculture, for irrigation. And that's why you see these blue lines. These are extensive network of irrigation drainage canals where the river water will be diverted for these agricultural fields. And the picture on the left are just one of the peak culture we have to work on for the last 10 years. And you can see we use flood irrigation. That literally means that the water will be released from the irrigation canal during the growing season and flood the field. And you can imagine during the hot, dry summer, a lot of that water will be lost by evaporation. So that means we lose a lot of that fresh water resources. if we zoom in on this peak orchard, these soils are developed on flat plain sediments. Later on, Dan will give you some idea. These soil textures are very different. You could have coarse materials like sandy materials next to clay materials, and they really impact how the water flow through the system. And more importantly, as I will explain, they will control exactly how much salt could potentially build up in these soils. So this specific peak orchard is representative of the area. We have about 100 years of cultivation. For this field, we had 60 years of cotton before 40 years ago, it was converted to the pecan trees because pecan price just going up and up in the last 40 years. We typically irrigate somewhere between 10 to 12 times from April to October. We'll use about 5 inches of water per year. So if you do annually, that will be equivalent of 1.5 meters of water. So that's a lot. And I don't know if you know, the Rio Grande runs from the Colorado. So we depend on the snowfall there in the winter. So the snow melt will recharge to the river. But last few years, the snowfall has been reduced in Colorado. So the river discharge has been really low. For example, in the Elephant Butte, which is in middle of New Mexico, where the water will be stored before the irrigation starts in April, which is around this time, it has been in historically low. We're probably at about 5 to 6% of our capacity of the reservoir. So I heard from the local growers and producers that they won't get any river water this year until June. And they probably only get 10 inches. So that's not enough to cover all their need for irrigation. So that's why for the peak orchard I work on, the Ivy family have local wells where they will pump groundwater for irrigation because these are perennial crops and you cannot afford not irrigating for a given year. So that will add to the cost to the operation. So that's why it's very important to understand the water dynamics here, to understand when you apply that 1.5 meters on the field, how much water is really used for transpiration, how much is simply lost by evaporation, and how much is actually infiltrating and recharged to the groundwaters. Not only that, when you have limited infiltration, and when you have intensive evaporation, the water will be lost, but the salts in the water has nowhere to go. So that's why soil salinization is a global problem, especially for dry land, where it's hot and dry evaporation is very intensive, especially in irrigated system, where we know we intentionally add water, therefore load more salts. And that's exactly the problem that challenge our agriculture systems here. On the left is a zoom in picture of the Google Earth map of the pecan orchard. And you can see that, even though these trees are planted exactly 40 years ago, but some trees are a lot smaller, for example, over here, and some are bigger. And the underlying control is the soil texture, and therefore the salt buildup. You can imagine that in coarser materials where the water flows through, that can drain the water, but also leach the salt. But if you have clay soil, the water will be pounded for a long time, and the water has nowhere to go but evaporation, and the salt have nowhere to go but accumulate. And eventually the soils will be impacted by this high salt content. That's why we call it soil salinity. And if the salt buildup is to a certain level, it will exceed the tolerance level of the crops. In that case, the roots cannot pull water from the soils anymore, even though we know the water is applied to the field and the soils are saturated. In extreme conditions, the water can be put away from the plants. And so that's why when you're experiencing the soil salinity problem, the tree growth will be stunted. And some of the visual kind of indicators you can use to realize the soils are challenged by soil salinity is the summer snow. We're not supposed to have snow in the summer, but if you see those white powders, which are evaporate salts, and we know they're typically white, just like your table salt, and that's the summer snow. And even worse, which I'm not going to focus on, is the soil acidity. That just means the soil has too much sodium. And that's what the picture show actually on the top right. When you have clay soils, when the soils are very sodic, that will control the soil structure. The clay will become very dispersed. So that means the infiltration of the water is even more reduced. So that means you're going to have more salt buildup in future years. So we have studied soil salinity for a long time, but when we studied it, we realized there are actually more problems than the salinity. And the problem is actually on carbon. So you can imagine that when you irrigate, where the water comes with the chemical constituents, for example, bicarbonate and calcium. If evaporation concentrates the remaining soil waters, the system will become supersaturated with respect to calcite. So that means the calcite will precipitate out. A lot of you probably are familiar with marine carbonate or Phytogenic carbonate in natural system, but nobody has really looked at the Phytogenic carbonate accumulation in dryland, in irrigated system. And not only that, this reaction produces calcite, but at the same time produce carbon dioxide. That's a greenhouse gases, right? And as far as we know, nobody had looked at this carbon dioxide fluxes before and study exactly what variables controlling the release of this carbon dioxide. But if you study critical zone or Earth surface, you know that at least the geochemists need to study it because this is a chemical reaction, right? We need to understand the thermodynamics. We need to understand the kinetics. But you also know we need a hydrologist to help us because this reaction is driven by supersaturation. So we really need to know the water fluxes so we know whether or not the system can reach saturation. We also need a biologist or ecologist to help us because this reaction produces what I call abiotic carbon dioxide. But we know, we have a peak orchard. So there's a biological processes happening at the same time. And not only that, but also it produces carbon dioxide through respiration. So that means, either it's through microbial activities, roots respiration, or decomposition of organic matter, the oxygen will be consumed and produce carbon dioxide. So the challenge is that we not only want to measure the fluxes of carbon dioxide, but we need to partition. We need to know how much is contributed by biological processes and how much is by this chemical reaction. So one of my PhD student in Bali here, he's trying to use sensor technologies where you can couple carbon dioxide sensors from eosense and the oxygen sensors from apogee because these two reactions consume oxygen differently. So by looking at the coupling or decoupling of carbon dioxide and oxygen, hopefully we'll be able to see more, which processes is more dominant. Also, we can use isotopes. If some of you are isotope geologists, you know that carbon dioxide, depending on the sources, might have very different carbon isotopes. So we can utilize, carbon dioxide isotope analyzers, where we can measure the fluxes of carbon dioxide, but also the isotope at the same time. So we can quantify the fluxes of such abiotic carbon dioxide. We are also exploring other technologies as well. So I'm showing here some colleagues I'm working with. One way we want to think about it is that we want to capture the temporal and spatial variability. The isotope analyzer I mentioned in the last slide give us information about the temporal scale because we put the sensor on the ground at one location, we can get data every 5 minutes. But as I also show you that the soil salinity is very different. So that means the water dynamics, the salt dynamics are very different within this peak orchard. So we also need to capture that physical and spatial heterogeneity. So that's why we're trying to couple different remote sensing technologies. For example, we could use hyperspectral imaging, or we can use something called tunable diode laser absorption spectrometry, where we can put these sensors that can measure either the carbon dioxide concentrations, therefore derive the carbon dioxide fluxes, and put them on the drones or put them on the rover so that we can run the system over the whole peak orchard so we can capture the contours of the carbon dioxide above, above the orchard. Also, we're working with colleague like here, Margaret Maritz-Tauser, who is an ecologist, who's going to use, eddy currents tower at different locations above the canopy, but below the canopy, so that we can look at the exchange of the carbon dioxide between the ecosystem with atmosphere, but also using concentration profiles or isotopes so that we can partition, understand different biological processes like, plant respiration, photosynthesis, storage, and cell respiration, and so on. So with that, I hope I give you some flavor that, how we can use different data sets and different technology to help us answer this question. With that, I'd like to pass on to my colleague, Diane.
So I want to talk a little bit about how we use geophysics in this whole process. Of course, you can't put sensors everywhere, especially in the soil or drill boreholes. So my contribution to some of the work is to be looking at more spatially with geophysical tools. So one of the things that we use is soil conductivity measurements, which students are being shown using here. And it is sensitive to the grain size of the soil, but one of the problems with using conductivity too is it's sensitive to moisture and salinity. So it's hard to say, well, why is this high? Is it because we have clay, or is it wet, or is it very wet and salty? The next slide. This gives an idea of how we've actually used this in the pecan grove. And what you're seeing on the right is, again, sort of a picture like the one that Lixin showed. Notice that there are these very white areas where the trees aren't growing very well. And then the darker areas are where we have healthy trees. And what we're comparing to on the left is a series of measurements of the soil conductivity. And the red areas are high conductivity. And we're measuring these conductivities at a depth of about 6 meters. And we found that there's probably a deeper clay layer near the roots of these trees that is affecting their ability to take up the water that they need. And so they're not doing very well. The next slide. Another thing that we use to help us try and determine grain size is that we found for the Rio Grande that it contains a lot of magnetic minerals in the very coarse parts of the river channel. In some cases, it's up to 10% magnetite. You can see the sand looks black in parts of the river channel. And so that helps us in determining where we might have river channels. And then in some of the other critical zone sites, we're using magnetics to look at the structure of the magnetic basement. Where are there faults? Where are there igneous rocks that might influence the flow of water through the system? This is just me doing a magnetic survey next to my house. My house is probably one of the best geophysical study areas around El Paso. And then the next slide shows the new work that we're just starting. This is a site that's to the north of El Paso. And we are trying to determine where there are faults and where there might be changes in the depth to basement. The red lines you see up top are the magnetic signatures. And then we're also measuring the very near surface changes in magnetism, which you can see in the black lines. And we think some of those are telling us, like when we get to a Phytogenic carbonate, we see a very, very low response. When we get to what we think are wind-blown sands, probably from old river channels with magnetite in them, we're seeing higher signatures. So this is something we're just beginning to work on that shows you we can use geophysics at a very deep scale to look at the water flow, but also very, very close to the surface. So I'll pass it back to you, Lixin.
Okay. I kind of want to emphasize the importance of interdisciplinary research in critical zone science. But are we actually comfortable doing so? How it takes to put a team together in a very organic way. So one thing is important is definitely communication. So Judah, if you could launch the next 3 posts. I'm just curious about, the audience, how you feel about communicating your research with different groups. So the first one will be how comfortable you are to discuss your research with politicians, social scientists, business leaders, or just citizens, right? Because some of you are probably know we're so good with talking to ourselves because we're so alike, we think alike. But what about you talk to other people who are not in your field? Are we seeing the results alive at this point?
Once all 3 questions of the poll are completed, then everyone will be able to see the results. Sorry about that.
I see. I see. Thank you. Okay, the results are in. Okay, so for the first question, are you comfortable with talking to politicians, citizens, social scientists? A quarter of you says you disagree with it, so you're not really comfortable talking to them. And half say I agree. That's great news, right? And a quarter say I strongly agree. So that's really great for our cohort. Are you comfortable with discussing my results with 8 years old? And again, results are similar to the last one. I'm glad because we are going to train the next generation of STEM students, right? And 8 years old will be a great starting point to talk about critical science and how it's related to risk environments. The last one is, are you comfortable with talking to other earth scientists? It shifts slightly. More than half, about half of you say I'm very comfortable. I strongly agree. So that's great. And you can see just by this exercise that, I think we're more comfortable talking to people who are just like us, right? You use the same jargon, you share a lot of passions and research method, you studied the earth science before. But when it comes down to people who don't have the similar background, we might struggle a little bit. I'm not pretending, I'm expert at all, but I borrowed a couple slides from my colleague, Diane Pennington from UTEP, because in the last 10 years, she has been, running workshops and, getting data to understand how for a team to work naturally together, right? What are the challenges? And here she shared like 7, the key points. I'm not going through them one by one, but you can imagine that jargon will probably is one of the challenges we're all facing. Is that even Diane and I are colleagues together at UTEP for 10 years, but we really just started to collaborate recently. So it takes really small step at a time. And sometimes when we talk about one word and different people really use it for different meanings, and sometimes that's really confusing. And also through these workshops, Diana actually learned, and published a lot of papers in the last 10 years. How do we naturally form this team that can work in interdisciplinary fashion? Definitely not just, formal presentations because people lost interest after second slides. It's probably better to start with a lightly structured participatory processes, just so that everybody on the same page, each other better. But after that, you start to work together to create some kind of the diagram that can lead, and so that it can align the goal for the whole team. So again, I'm not pretending I'm an expert. I'm hoping that some of the discussion in the breakout sections will talk about this. But I think that's the future of the critical zone research, or maybe other research as well. We're going from multidisciplinary to interdisciplinary and eventually to transdisciplinary, where we can keep the stakeholders in mind when we do this research so we can make greater impact. So with that, I'd like to stop here and see if there's any questions.